Before we go into what it means for Pakistan, I think we need to kind of be very clear on what the Afghan Taliban as an entity are. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstandings on multiple fronts from it. Half of the people only tend to think of Afghan Taliban as some kind of a militant group which has gone too big and has kind of just started invading areas and occupying areas and eventually has taken over all of Afghanistan by force. And the other half tend to look at Afghan Taliban as some kind of a rightful ruler of Afghanistan that wants to secure the country from the last 20 years of a forced imperialist ISAF controlled occupation. And the truth is somewhere in between. Because once again, our imagination of the Afghan Taliban is related to what happened in with regards to the Soviet Afghan conflict in the 80s. And unfortunately, there's a misunderstanding of there because the Mujahideen that were fighting at that time is very different from the Taliban of the 90s, which took over Afghanistan. And that Taliban is very different from the current Taliban iteration. There's complete differences with regards to leadership, complete differences with regard to operational efficacy. And that's a very important part to understand if we have to really get to the root of this. The second thing we need to understand is that there is an assumption being made currently that the Afghan Taliban have just taken over by force, and it's such a major surprise. And all these armchair intellectuals and analysts have been sitting back thinking, oh, Afghan Taliban is not going to take over. Even the United States government, Biden thought the same thing, and that didn't happen. The problem that people don't understand in parts outside of Afghanistan is that the Afghan Taliban have actual political legitimacy within Afghanistan as well. Even though they took the country by force, there's a need to understand why it was so easy for them. And it's not just the Afghan government's failures, the military's failures. They do have actual support. A lot of the Pashtun population of Afghanistan genuinely support the Taliban. We can discuss the merits of that legitimacy, but it's nonetheless something that needs to be acknowledged. Pakistan is in a very tricky situation because of this. Because if you support the Afghan Taliban, you risk the ire of the international community. If you oppose them, you risk the potential of terrorism and violence on the Western side, not to mention the possibility of ethnic insurrection being militarized on the Western border side as well. So Pakistan is in a very difficult situation. And I think given our options, it's more than likely to opt for some kind of resolution where the Afghan Taliban are somewhat legitimized as a political entity, a viable political entity within Afghanistan. What that means for the marginalized communities, groups over there, what it means for those that oppose the Taliban all these 20 years, that's a matter that remains to be seen, but it's certainly a grim prospect. In order to understand what the Pakistan government is thinking, that's frankly speaking an exercise in futility. Because if we know anything about how governments respond, at least here, it's mostly in response to crises. There's no such thing as an aforementioned or preparation-oriented perspective. There's never a proactive approach to policy making. You usually wait for the crisis to happen, and then after that, you decide on the policy. So, for example, it was going to happen once Biden decided that we were going to pull out, that a lot of pressure is going to come on Pakistan via the refugee crisis. And right now, the only policy that has come from, or any statement that's come from Pakistan is that, we cannot take any more refugees, this is not our responsibility, we're going to be geofencing. That's our current statement. But what that's not taking into consideration is that there will be a refugee crisis, whether you like it or not. And because of that, there's going to be a massive influx from people on the western side of the border. Now that puts you in a difficult predicament. What are you going to do in that situation? Are you going to push them back? If you push them back, it will be by force, and in turn, it will lead to a humanitarian conflict. And the international community will see you as actually enabling the violence against groups that are trying to escape the Taliban. So you'll be seen as part of the problem then. On the other hand, if you incorporate them and you actually set up refugee camps, that puts pressure on your economy and society in ways that you really can't withstand. So Pakistan really is in that situation where it's kind of choosing to ignore the problem, not ignore the problem, but just say, okay, no, we're just not going to accept this crisis. But the crisis is coming to you no matter what. Similarly, there's a failure to understand, and I'm afraid this failure exists even at the topmost level, that somehow, the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban are like, two different entities. And that, this is more of a case of domestic terrorism and extremism. And what the Afghan Taliban are doing is like a completely separate thing to, liberate Afghanistan and so on and so forth. This is a very big misunderstanding that exists even among policymakers in society. Why is this relevant for Pakistan? I'm going to just show you, just share a snippet of a report. I'll probably share the link with your viewers as well. This is the United Nations Security Council report of June 2021. I'm just going to quote it very, very quickly, if that's okay. TTP and the Taliban carry on with relations mainly as before. A reunification took place in Afghanistan between TTP and certain splinter groups in the period from December 2019 to August 2020. This includes Sharia al-Massoud Group, Jamaat al-Ahrar, Hizbul Ahrar, Amjad Farooqi Group, formerly which was part of Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and Al-Qaeda was reportedly involved in the moderation between the groups. The return of the splinter groups means that TTP's strength has increased more than twice as before. And it also states, the report also states that the group has destructively anti-Pakistan objectives, but also supports the Afghan Taliban militarily inside Afghanistan against Afghan forces. So when people say that, that problem is separate and the Pakistan Taliban are separate, they don't know what they're talking about. And that nexus is going to inevitably affect your security situation here. If you're thinking that the Afghan Taliban setting up an emirate is not going to embolden groups over here, is not going to encourage them to carry out similar actions, and is not going to make them reach out to Afghan Taliban for their political legitimacy and back in Pakistan, you have another thing coming. And this is only the start. This is going to happen with other groups as well. Already there is talk of an ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, in excess with the Afghan Taliban. Their ETIM, for those of you who don't know, is an extremist group of the Uyghur community, which China is heavily opposed to. And if there is a nexus between ETIM and Afghan Taliban, what do you think is going to happen here? China is going to start pressurizing Pakistan to negotiate with the Afghan Taliban to get rid of ETIM, which in turn means that there's going to be another level of do more with regards to Pakistan and China, which is going to put pressure on our relations, which is going to potentially put pressure on CPEC. And that, of course, adds in a different level of diplomatic pressure, because you can go all day long saying the US has made a mess of Afghanistan, but you can't afford to use those words with China. That puts you in a difficult situation. And I'm just talking about the state level mess ups that can happen. The refugee crisis, the emboldening of domestic terror groups, the fact that it's going to harm your foreign relations. I'm not even talking about the ramifications it will have for society. This is a very, very major crisis, which I don't think is not being, I wouldn't say being taken too seriously, but we are not really getting into the complexities of these ramifications. And they're going to be very, very severe. Make no mistake about it. There are two basic levels in which this emboldening happens. One level is the one that you're talking about, where groups feel that, well, if violence really is the way to achieve political legitimacy and it worked for them, why can't it work for us? And why I mention the nexus is really important, because it's not just us being inspired by the Afghan Taliban. We are actively, when I say we, I mean the TTP is actively operating with them through joint collaborations. They're carrying out operations in Afghanistan as well. And you have groups like the Haqqanis, you have groups like LEJ that are actually kind of helping, create a nexus between these groups. Same is true for Al-Qaeda as well. So it's not just going to be that they're going to be encouraged by it. I think there is a very serious possibility that they will actively seek support via the Afghan Taliban. And if they do set up a political government, then you might see them using diplomacy or diplomatic tools as well as violence jointly used against Pakistan to kind of pressurize people, pressurize policymakers into legitimizing the TTP as a proper political stakeholder. And whenever you do that, it's always turned out bad. You made that mistake in 2008 with SAMAA. You also made a similar mistake in 2017 with the TLP, and you let them grow bigger than their boots. And then even though you carried out raids against them, but the fact is the militarization and weaponization of the blasphemy issue is never going to go back to its original state. It's only going to get worse. And frankly speaking, TLP has parliamentarians and in provincial assemblies as well. These guys have become politically legitimate as well. So One is that level at which they're going to get emboldened, they're going to become legitimate. And then eventually that legitimacy will go into the societal grassroots level, where people will be using this as a recruitment tool. They will think, well, let's radicalize our people some more. And let's be very honest, there is a lot of public support for issues like blasphemy, for issues like sectarianism. And these are what we call gateway issues, issues that are easy for people to accept. And once you kind of pull people into that ideology, then you can kind of engage them on the operational level, which is where groups like LEJ and where groups like TTP are excellent at, not just ideologically recruiting people, but then getting them involved in the operations aspect. The Pakistan government has traditionally sought to do two things. One is either to negotiate with these groups, for example, which happened in the case of SAMAA, they'll happen in the case of the Faizabad riots. The second option that they have done is to try and somehow ideologically go ahead of these groups to try and neutralize their appeal. So, for instance, when the recent clashes took place of TLP, our prime minister, as well as other parliamentarians, went off saying that the blasphemy issue is really important and going on international forums to talking about that, right? And what that does is, in your eagerness to kind of get ahead of them, you are actually pushing yourself ideologically further towards their agenda. And that in turn is pseudo radicalizing your own policy making apparatus. And that's very dangerous, because by trying to co opt them ideologically, there's always the fear that you might not oppose them when they're operationally against you either. So, what is to, for instance, if I extrapolated, not that I'm saying it will, but how are you going to get ahead of the Afghan Taliban? Are you going to say that, yeah, maybe we should have, burqas enforced as well? Are you going to start saying things like that in order to get ahead of them? You can't do that. The more you try and co-opt those ideological leanings, the more that will embolden them to do even further. It's not going to end up well. All of these are short-term appeasement tactics which have never worked for us in the long run. We've seen this in the case of sectarianism, with Zia co-opting sectarian elements in the 80s as a counter to Iran, and how that's ended up in blowback for us now. We've seen that with the case of TTP, where there was this notion that if we politically legitimize them in Swat and Northwest, they won't create trouble for us, which they are still. And now you are seeing that the last 2-3 years with regards to blasphemy. When will we ever learn as a state that these tactics don't work? These groups are never satisfied with just ideological acceptance. They'll always want more. And whenever that happens, things always end up bad for us, for society. The rise of extremism, the rise of terrorism, the rise of attacks against marginalized communities, against women. These are all very serious concerns now. I've been I mean, a lot of my work has been focused on SWAT, especially post 2008, the military operations, the response that took place. And there was I've always felt that, once the conflict was over, there is a need to renormalize the situation and to kind of get people, to get back to the days before the SWAT Taliban had kind of ravaged everything. And so I started a personal project with a few friends where I've set up an ecotourism thing in Swat. I've set up like a small business with the idea that, we want to kind of, the idea was to empower locals and local livelihoods, and carrying out tourism in an environmentally responsible way, and to kind of use that as an opportunity to bring people back to Swat and to make them feel that the Northwest and all of the terrible things that happened before, that's the past, and these people deserve a second chance at life. And I'll be very honest with you, the last couple of days, me and my business partners have been thinking about this and talking about this, and we're very worried. We're very worried that it's not just about my business, it's the idea that people who are trying to come back to normalization after a decade of being ravaged economically, socially, that chance is being stolen from them again. I really hope that doesn't happen. We're all hoping for the best, that violence doesn't affect our side of the border. And I'll be very honest, I mean, it's not like Pakistan is responsible for this solely. There's a lot of other countries that have also been responsible for this. But in the back of my mind, I'm really concerned about the people of Swat. I'm really concerned about the people of the Northwest, of formerly FATA, of how this crisis is going to affect them, and eventually how that crisis might foment conflict over here, and how people who just want a second chance at life are potentially going to be denied of it because of all this violence coming at their doorstep. That's the thing that's really
Yeah.
upsetting. You and I can sit in our rooms in Islamabad and Karachi. Not to say, by the way, we haven't experienced violence. We absolutely have. But for those people who are literally
It's very
relying,
livid.
yeah, for them to relive it, I can't possibly imagine what this is going to do to them. After all that we have, made them realize, after all of the hope that we've provided, after all of the confidence we've given to the international community that no, come back to Pakistan, things are finally back to business as usual. My concern is that all of that is going to be washed away with this. To be honest with you, I think the first and foremost response that I would have is stop having this schadenfreude over the US failing.
Explain that.
What I mean by that is that like there's this narrative going on that the last 20 years the international forces tried their level best to dominate the Taliban, but they couldn't, and now they're finally back, and you know people are like relishing the fact that the US failed. They're kind of comparing it to Vietnam, and they're like Afghanistan's a graveyard of empires and all of that. I understand that narrative. And it is of course an exciting narrative to like look at, the idea of an imperialist force being crushed and so on and so forth. But that schadenfreude is not going to last, because once the US pulls out, it's not going to be that the United States is the only casualty of this conflict. This is eventually going to affect Pakistan too. The other thing that I would say to people is please stop thinking of a romanticized version of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and Sharia under the Taliban. You need to do some more research on how the 90s were. You need to look back at those reports. You need to look more into reports of force marriages happening in Afghanistan, which, by the way, is a new tendency that the Afghan Taliban apparently has picked from IS. You need to stop looking at everything as some kind of an international propaganda to malign Pakistan and its institutions. While that is very much there, you still need to do more research on understanding how this conflict is going to affect our people. This is not a case of, an enemy being defeated and us being victorious. What is our victory in this situation? A refugee crisis, people being homeless, marginalized communities being targeted, conflict over here, ethnic tensions over here. We're in no way coming out victorious from this. So please, my advice to young people would be, please do more research on conflict in Afghanistan. Please stop looking at memes as sources of information and facts. Please, memes are not facts. Do actual work on this if you really care. And please stop being keyboard warriors. Do something to actually help people in that conflict. Supporting livelihoods is one part of it, of course. There will be people who will need our help on the other side of the border. I understand the state is reluctant, but nonetheless, our society should be supporting people on the other side, not just because there are neighbors, but because a lot of families exist on both sides of the border. So you are technically helping our very own people. We've seen this spirit of philanthropy. People forget that during the IDP and TDP crisis in the Northwest a decade ago, the majority of residents were not being housed in refugee camps. Over 80% of them were actually being housed in homes like yours or mine, by relatives, by friends, by well-wishers. Please understand that there is much more that is going to come out of this conflict. So emotionally pace yourselves, do some work, see how you can help, and stop looking at online trolling as an effective way of winning these narrative wars. You're not going to convince anyone but yourself and your like-minded group of people. Please understand that this is about human lives, real lives that are going through real suffering. This is not a case of us versus them. This is going to affect everyone in ways that you or I may not even anticipate yet. And before we get into our great I told you so arguments, please understand that there is more to this conflict than we think. and we need to predict and we need to prepare ourselves for what's going to happen in the coming months. That's all I would say.